what I find so hopeful about the Italian story, like for Europe, actually, in this moment, at the beginning of the 1800s, it was divided, it was impoverished, it was falling behind. It was a place that was sort of worshipful of old glories, was kind of like a peninsula just full of museums for more wealthy Europeans to come and look around it. But by 1987, we had this thing called the Il Sorpasso, where Italy, only briefly, sadly, but Italy briefly became a wealthier country than the United Kingdom.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Murray, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics is Robert Morris. How are you this time, Robert?
I'm interested. I'm excited. We're podcasting from the past now, Rory. Like when this episode comes out, we're going to be.
I would like to say I always thought Trump was wonderful. Rob forced me to say all those horrible things, and I, for one, welcome our new Trumpian overlords.
Indeed. Yeah, we're going to have to start watching ourselves. I mean, who knows? Maybe it could be Trumpoid or Kamalaite stormtroopers coming for any of us. Who knows?
Wow.
Who knows?
Yeah, I feel Kamala might be a bit more of the same, except a man or a woman who is a bit more sane and on the right end of 60.
Yeah, I think we'll probably be okay for a little while under either new regime, but. When this is listened to, we are, I mean, honestly, most likely we'll be in the same sort of interminable haggling over the votes, lawfare nonsense that we did for, was it a couple weeks in 2020 we did that? It felt like forever.
Yeah, there's talk that it could be January until it's like completely decided, because it's going to be a very small amount of people decide this election.
I mean, thankfully, it's never what you expect. That's horrible about an election, I find. It's always some new thing. Like there'll be some new terrible thing. Potentially, who knows, maybe more assassination attempts or bombings or something like that. And it won't be the horrible thing that happened the last time that we're all preparing for. But who knows? We might actually have a landslide and one or another of these people actually being president by the time this is published. We shall see.
Well, would you like to talk about another country with a female leader?
Yes, indeed. Though I gotta say, I didn't actually look into Giorgia Meloni that much for this podcast, because today we're going to be talking about Italian history, specifically modern Italian history, which I think gets kind of short shrift, which I think is kind of a shame because it's really interesting. And I think it actually provides some kind of hopeful models for a lot of people all over the world. Before we get into it, I just want to say that this episode of the More Freedom Foundation podcast is heavily based on this book, The Force of Destiny, A History of Italy Since 1796 by Christopher Duggan. Highly recommend this. Over the course of this episode, we're going to be making the case that you should know more about Italian history, and this is a perfectly great place to start. I enjoyed it, found it very informative, surprising at parts, well written, kept the story moving along. The Force of Destiny, History of Italy Since 1796 by Christopher Duggan. Highly recommend it.
This is a very ambitious episode. Napoleon to the modern day?
Well, we're going to try it. We're going to see how it works. I think that the process of Italian unification and Italian state building gets kind of ignored because it's complicated and it's weird. And honestly, it's not even that like satisfying even to like Italian nationalists. Like it's a weird cavalcade of disasters, but it kind of ended up working miraculously well. At the beginning of the period of time we want to talk about today, Italy was an incredibly backward place. It had been in the 1300s, it had been, and then 1,000 years before that, as sort of the headquarters of Rome, the Roman Empire. It had been among the richest and most successful places in the world in human history. But by the 1700s, 1800s, that was a lot of vanished glory there, as they had been outpaced by Muslim empires, as they'd been especially outpaced by bordering nation states in Europe. So Italy was divided. It was backward in lots of places. It was impoverished outside of a few marquee cities that are still visited today. A lot of, the populations that we now see today as Italian spoke languages that were mutually unintelligible. Like that they spoke different languages. It was a divided
I heard that's
place.
One theory about Italians' fondness for gesticulation.
Oh, interesting.
That it's one way of getting past the language barriers was to do a sort of a internet or an Italian-based sign language. So that's one theory I've heard.
I have never heard that before. That is fascinating, but would make it kind of sense.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's also come up with something I always wondered, like a kind of, sorry to sidetrack you, but like I know how Esperanto's kind of failed, but I don't feel like anyone has like a true like nationalistic love for a sign language. I almost feel like if you went, here's 100 things, let's just say Europe tries it and goes, look, here's 100 things to understand basic things in the world. I just feel like it might be a nice way of being like a sort of lingua franca for a lot of things where people don't take it too seriously. It's like, oh, okay, this is how you talk basic things to someone all around Europe. But anyway, I've sidetracked you. I apologize.
No. Always eager to talk about Esperanto. What I find so hopeful about the Italian story, like for Europe, actually, in this moment, is that at the beginning of the 1800s, it was divided, it was impoverished, it was falling behind. It was a place that was sort of worshipful of old glories, was kind of like a peninsula just full of museums for more wealthy Europeans to come and look around it. But by 1987, we had this thing called the Il Sorpasso, where Italy, only briefly, sadly, but Italy briefly became a wealthier country than the United Kingdom, which had, played large parts in sort of batting Italy around for centuries prior to that. So what's fascinating about the Italian unification story is it's frankly comedic a bit in how bad Italy was at winning anything. Like, they did not really win their independence. Other countries did that. They did not really win any of the chunks of territory that they were able to add to what became Italy. But through this process of suffering and loss, a modern Italian state was absolutely built, and it was an extraordinarily successful modern Italian state. It is still to this day, with all of the chaos that can sometimes be illustrated in Italian politics. It's a really extraordinary story, and I think there's a lot in it, perhaps more in it than there is in more typical models for the European Union, like the United States unifying or Germany unifying. I think there's more in it that might be useful or inspiring for the process of European unification than is typically acknowledged. And I think that's something that makes this worth looking into today.
Do you think Italy gets overlooked in general? Because it's like Europe's second largest manufacturer is Italy, but the way people talk about it, you think it's only Germany and everyone else is just, doing some tax scheme or something. And also the fact, like, it's a huge contributor to NATO, because quite often it's a bit like, well, it's not meeting its 2%, so it's just a big lazy idiot. And you're like, oh, it's actually contributes a massive amount and is a very well-armed and intimidating force. It just feels like, for some reason, Italy's just always kind of forgotten about.
I think that's a relatively new dynamic, and I don't fully understand it, nor did I research it. But since there are countries that joining the European Union, or specifically the European currency, the euro, worked out well for, and there are countries that it really, really didn't work out for. And I think like Italy is probably number two in the didn't work out for list. It was worst of all for Greece.
I think the euros kind of tried to be the Deutschmark. When I heard Italy tend to treat money more like a utility, it's like, well, if there's a problem, throw money at it. It's like, that's what it's for. It's not real. While other countries like Germany, it's a bit like hoard it all, never spend your money. You've got to save forever. Tomorrow could be terrible. So I think when you have it, almost feels like you should have like 2 euros. One's for ones that treat money more like a utility that should be spread around, and others that are a bit more like, just save it and hope for the best.
Well, that all sounds entirely plausible, and I've spent years trying to wrap my head around it, Rory, and I just don't get it. Italy not only experienced a more extreme version of the Trente Glorieuses in the post-World War II economic just rampage, like they did incredibly well, and then they also did really well in the 80s and 90s when a lot of other countries in the world and in Europe, faltered. So they just did amazingly well until they adopted the euro, which I think, as you suggest, came with German versions of monetary utilization. And since then, their economy has been essentially flat. It just has not grown in a serious way since adopting the euro a quarter century ago, which is nuts. And I don't get it. And I don't, that's not what we're talking about today. But I think that's the reason why Italy has become such a sort of
overlooked
afterthought, just not taken particularly seriously. It was interesting in the sort of Eurozone crises, serial crises between, 2009 and 2013. Italy was already kind of an afterthought, but people were like, okay, like Ireland is having trouble, Greece is having trouble, but if Italy has a sovereign debt crisis, the EU is over, essentially. Like the Euro project is done, which I think clarified for a lot of people how important Italy still remains. But it is interesting, just thinking about in the aftermath of World War I, Italy was considered, along with, I think, France, the UK, the United States, Japan, and Italy, were considered sort of like the Security Council of the time, like the true world powers. And that is not, of course, where Italy is today. But the fact that they were there in World War I, the fact that 70 years later they were able to have a larger economy than Great Britain, indicates an extraordinary level of success for a country that seems to have never won a war. And I want to talk about that today. So we should get into
how
it.
terribly they did in World War I.
Yeah, it's kind of extraordinary, but got to sit at the winners' table anyway. And that is kind of the story of Italian unification, is being really bad at war, but getting to sit at the winners' table anyway. Which, perhaps, it is the country of Machiavelli after all. You can make an argument that winning at diplomacy is just as important as winning at war. But what I find more interesting is that over these decades of hope and passion and extraordinary disappointment, somehow a unified, successful, incredibly prosperous Italy was forged. And that's something that we tease out a little bit today. So let's start with Napoleon. Napoleon was a starting point.
Like we always should.
Yes, indeed. Well, I often feel that history sort of began with the Industrial Revolution, and Napoleon's around the same time. So I do sort of see what was going on with Napoleon and after Napoleon as a lot more important than everything that came before, which I know a lot of people disagree with, but here we are. For the Arabs, for the Germans, and for the Italians, as well as most other nationalities in Europe, Napoleon was the Big Bang. Napoleon and the French Revolution, this idea of nationalism, a nation in arms, what was possible with a modern nationalism and a modern conception of unified language and territory. This unleashed extraordinary horrors, of course, in the 20th century, but it's also an idea that has been tremendously powerful all the world over. I mean, we spent the last episode talking about Myanmar, and also it's all nationalism, and to some extent, a lot, or certainly at least the ways that people depict themselves and their national causes worldwide have their roots in sort of this Napoleonic era. And the Italians, like the Germans and the Arabs, specifically I mentioned, were all people who had to deal with Napoleon personally showing up on their doorstep, taking over and illustrating that they had fallen behind in fairly serious ways. And this was definitely the case with French armies rampaging through Italy between 1796 and 1815. Napoleon did some very helpfully anti-democratic stuff. Actually, he kind of murdered the last...
That's the opposite of last episode's mantra.
Helpfully anti-democratic. Well, it's a couple hundred years ago, so we can talk about this sort of thing. He essentially murdered the ancient republics of Genoa and Venice. Genoa and Venice were the last winners of the sort of war of all against all of Italian city-states, these extraordinarily successful and wealthy Italian city-states that built themselves up in the ruins of the Roman Empire in the medieval period. And by the 1700s, most of these cities had been absorbed into larger, not very successful polities, but not very large polities. Most of northern Italy was controlled by the Austrians. The Venetians and the Genoese still had these independent merchant republics. Napoleon crushed all that. And Napoleon started the process of both getting Italians thinking and like, wait a second, these French nationalists have done so well for themselves. Why can't the Italian nationalists do well for themselves? And also just throwing some of these mini city-states together into larger Italian polities. Napoleon controlled, I think, the entirety or most of the boot of Italy at some point in the first decade and a half of the 1800s. He didn't put them all together as one kingdom of Italy, but there was a kingdom of Italy and a kingdom of Naples. And a lot of his sweeping away of administrative divisions persisted, as it did in Germany. And he just sort of like set a lot of intellectuals in a direction towards, hey, wait a second, Italy should be unified and Italy should be free. In the direct aftermath of 1815, the serial defeats of Napoleon, Italy got none of what it wanted. And at that point, it was still in a very divided country, locked in some of the most backward versions of Catholicism, illiterate country, this, that, and the other thing. It was probably only a rather small section of intellectuals that had fallen in love with this dream of Italian unification. That changed over the period between 1815 and 1848. It's important to emphasize that these were a bunch of independent, dependent collections of geographical areas. Like there were bigger deals, like there was Sardinia, which ended up acting in sort of the Prussia role for uniting Germany. Germany was united by the Prussians, more or less. Sardinia kind of served that purpose for Italy, though they were sort of never as successful as the Prussians. I think they were consciously trying to be the Prussians for Italy, and a lot of Italians outside of Sardinia wanted them to be the Prussians for Italy. They just were never as good at winning wars as the Prussians were. But they did a good job of aligning with the Prussians at the right times, which ended up leading to Italian unification. So that's Sardinia, you had Tuscany, you had the Veneto, and all of these different arenas had differing attempts at constitutionalism, differing uprisings, this, that, and the other thing. But they did tend to inspire each other, sort of copycat versions. And when we got to 1848, where modern transportation and communication links, or more modern transportation and communication links, the first railroads had been put in place, we saw this incredible dynamic in 1848, one of the most extraordinary years in European history, where the whole continent, really for the first and last time, kind of rose as one behind national and liberal ideas. At that point, we saw Sardinia really try to create a unified northern Italy by marching into a bunch of Austrian territories that had experienced street uprisings against the Austrians, and then the Sardinians came in with the armies. Confusingly, sometimes it's called Sardinia, sometimes it's called Piedmont Sardinia. I'm sure I'm violating the appropriate linguistic treatment here, but it's they sort of marched in, and as happened pretty much almost everywhere in 1848, by 1849, the national aspirations of the Italians, the Hungarians, the Germans were all crushed, and the Sardinian military was defeated. Funny thing about 1848 is, in the short term, all the nationalist uprisings lost, but in the long term, many of them won. And the Italians were among the winner's circle. Piedmont Sardinia realized that they weren't going to defeat the Austrians on their own, So in 1859 or thereabouts, they decided to team up with a new Napoleon, the famously not as successful Napoleon III,
Yes.
the nephew of the
Oh.
conquering, world's historically important Napoleon. And he decided that he would team up with Piedmont Sardinia to go to war against Austria. As is characteristic for Napoleon III, this kind of got away from him. There were deals that were made. There were expectations about what France was going to get and what Sardinia was going to get. And they got kind of overthrown by a sort of random revolutionary who's still got statues all over the parks of New York City, a guy by the name of Garibaldi. Northern Italy and southern Italy still retain some divisions. Not sure how familiar you are with this, Rory, but there are a lot of elements in Italian politics.
The main divisions would be north and south, because the north is a lot more Germanic, while the south can be what's considered a bit more Mediterranean.
Well, the north is fundamentally a lot richer. And this was the case.
Yes, that's where all the industry is.
Yes, this was the case even in 1859, 1860. And the North was very excited. Sardinia was very excited about a unified Northern Italian republic, and it was kind of like, take it or leave it about the rest of Southern Italy. But Garibaldi, this sort of romantic revolutionary hero, who I think fought in the U.S. Civil War on the Union side, I believe. I think I remember noticing that. Took 1,000 guys, went down to what I believe was still the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies at that point, took over Sicily and southern Italy and said, "Ha-ha! Northern Italy, we've given you the South. We are unified." And the Piedmont Sardinia, with their famous, I think, Prime Minister Cavour and their King Vittorio Emanuele II, were like, thanks, I guess. So from the get-go, the unified Italy was kind of unintentional and the result of the enthusiasm certain Italian nationalists, and not necessarily the people who were in charge of what became the unified Italy. And it just sort of, I mentioned that, I'm sure there are folks in Italy who would see this as like an overly negative description, but it's just kind of comedic, and it kind of illustrates the sense of chance or contingency that makes up so much of history. And it's just to illustrate that, like, there's nothing that says that the EU can't make it work as a unified entity and powerful on the world stage. There's nothing that says that, like, the people in Myanmar can't figure out how to have a functional federalist country that's wealthy and populous. Because if the Italians could make it work, and work extraordinarily well through this absolute like comedy of errors, then anybody can. And I think that's we're trying to do a hopeful episode here, Rory. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, it's all very impressive, and this is a country you've been to multiple times. What was your impressions?
Yeah. Oh, it's paradise. It's an extraordinary place with extraordinary food.
I don't think really praise can get any better than that.
Oh, it's the food, the history. I don't think it's a secret to anybody that I'm a bit of a history buff, and just the ability to stumble around an Italian city in an afternoon, gorge myself on history and pasta is one of the nicest things to do. It's funny, every
history and pasta. I've told you before, there's too much history. Italy's incredibly industrious, and they've been trying to make a new subway in Rome, but they just keep finding huge amounts of archaeology, which makes it a lot slower than it should be.
Well, there's always this duality to Italy, where there's a lot about Italian politics that remains chaotic. I haven't done the research I need to do on Giorgia Meloni, but my understanding is that there's some real questions and problems there. I remember very well that Silvio Berlusconi is the closest thing to a inspiration for Trump that you can find in among the wealthy democracies.
Definitely.
But at the same time, Italy is not just a place of history and culture, but extraordinary engineering prowess. Folks are talking about, in transportation circles in the United States, folks are very jealous of the ability of Italy to build massive urban metro systems, subway systems, for mere billions of dollars. In New York City, it cost $2 billion to build a station on a long-promised line. In Milan, I think specifically, in Milan specifically, I think over the past decade or something along those lines, for just a few hundreds of millions of dollars, Italian engineers and bureaucrats have managed to dramatically extend their subway system. So it's a tremendously a country of incredible capacity and a country of incredible chaos.
Well, there's something very interesting about that. Is it maybe you were talking about it, something coming out of chaos? It seemed to be a lot of corruption was going on in Italy with the contracts going to certain companies. So Italy was like, we've had enough of this. We're making it all going to be in-house and it's going to be a government. So quite often governments just pay private companies to do, engineering work for them, while Italy now has it that they are proper government employees. So when Italy wants to make a tunnel, as you talked about, they know exactly how much it costs because they are the government. So it gets done on time, and it gets done on budget. This is something that Ireland at the moment is abysmal at. To the point where American companies are talking about pulling out because they can't build enough houses and the transport's terrible. So also Italy has outstanding train infrastructure. So one theory is we could just get the Italians to do it, but I think a lot of it has to do with purchasing the track and all that there stuff. But no, Italy is bizarrely outstanding, and I think it doesn't seem to get nearly enough credit that it should. While Germany seems to get all this credit, when at the moment Germany isn't the most optimistic.
That is interesting. It's sort of the anti-privatization of a lot of these services. And then that's the problem. Obviously, the United States, we love to talk about unions, or at least the business-owned publications of the United States love to talk about unions. Yet France, with its unions, can build everything much more cheaply than the United States. I think the primary problem at this point in the United States, the primary cost problem is the consultants. We don't just outsource everything to the most expensive contractors imaginable. We also pay tens of millions of dollars at every step of the way to consultants to get the environmental approvals, to analyze which contractors we want to use, and it's a ballooning mess. But anyway, we don't want to talk about railway construction today. We want to talk about Italian unification.
The way Italy unified, so you'd say it's a nice template for other ones? Because it seems very chaotic. But I guess all unifications are.
That's exactly the point. All unifications are chaotic, and we tend to gravitate towards more romantic, more impressive versions of national unification. I mean, despite the fact that Napoleon got his ass kicked and the French Revolution is still a disputed thing, it's all very romantic, it's all very dramatic, and it all looks very successful at some points. Italian unification never looks successful, is always chaotic, yet succeeded. And I think that's the sort of the key message we're trying to put forward today. So on March 17th, 1861, the Italian Republic is proclaimed. Vittorio Emanuele II, who controversially refused to become Vittorio Emanuele I of the Kingdom of Italy, he kept his old name as the Vittorio Emanuele II of Sardinia. They actually had to pay off France with some territorial. Piedmont, Sardinia gave Nice. Apparently, Nice used to be part of Sardinia, but now it's part of France. And they had their Kingdom of Italy, and instantly had massive problems. I was inspired because of a great book that I read on Italian unification, and I just want to emphasize that we are glossing over a ton of really fractious, difficult, just turmoil, true, especially in the South, but also throughout the North. A lot of towns and cities who did not want to be unified, who were repressed in horrific ways, who didn't understand Italian and didn't understand why they were being forced to deal with these sorts of things. So it was a very fraught, chaotic process, but it is one that was eventually successful. So in 1866, the two great gaps in Italy, as it was formed in 1861, where they didn't have Venice, which was still controlled to some degree by the Austrians, and they didn't have Rome, which was controlled by the Pope.
As it should be.
And the sort of catch-22 with Napoleon III, oh, there you go, The catch-22 with Napoleon III was eager to screw over the Austrians and help Italy unify if he could get benefit out of it. He was also someone who was interested in leveraging the Catholic faith of the French nation. So he was not interested in screwing over the Pope. So he actually kind of occupied Rome. French troops defended papal control of Rome and its environs. I'm not sure how many of the classic papal states were controlled, but regardless, Rome and some of the surrounding territory was very much still the Pope's, defended by a French military. Austria was handled by Venice. And this is where the Prussians come in. It is interesting that Germany was unified by the Prussians within a decade or two, Italy being unified by the Sardinians. And this is all happening at more or less the same decade as the U.S. Civil War, like a tremendously, and this at the same time as Britain is crushing both India and China. So it's a tremendously eventful couple decades here. What happens is Austria goes to war with Germany, which makes Italy go, aha, we can take Venice. And the Kingdom of Italy puts together its military. They're excited. The Austrians are getting their butts kicked by the Prussians. We're going to go take Venice. And they lose. They lose miserably. The Austrians clean their clocks. They fail to take Venice militarily, but it doesn't matter because they get to sit at the winner's table anyway. And that's how they got Venice. They failed to take it militarily, but they got it anyway because they played their diplomatic cards right. This has a lot to do with how the the Kingdom of Italy was sort of, I would say, not quite completed because they did get some territorial gains from World War I, but sort of the classical period of the Risorgimento, the resurgence, happened in 1870 because Napoleon III, their sort of French patron, went to war against Prussia. This is also the war in 1870 that led to the unification of Germany, which worked out for everybody. So Prussia beats France, actually captures Napoleon III. So those French troops swiftly leave Rome, and there you have the Kingdom of Italy. And it is just fascinating how they managed to end up with the dream of Italian nationalists of 70 years prior without actually winning anything. It just sort of happened. And I think is a testament to just sort of persistence and knowing what you want. Because if you do know what you want as a national group in politics, eventually the stars will align. I think that perhaps the massive problem with the EU at this point is it's not entirely certain what it wants. You know, what degree of financial unification does it want? What degree of, what's it, ever stronger union or something? There's some catchphrase that the EU is working towards that. And it's not so clear, but perhaps.
But also things like you still don't really have a fully open market because, for instance, you can't just get car insurance from an Italian company if you're in Ireland. Like, theoretically, you should have that, but it feels like it's an open market for corporations, but not for individuals.
Well, I don't think you have that in the United States. Well, maybe you do. No, yeah, that's true. There are insurance companies that you can go nationwide in the U.S., but there is some division from state market to state market. I know health insurance is completely balkanized from state to state. But I mean, perhaps like in a more hopeful way, like the EU does know that it wants to move closer together, does know that it wants to be unified in certain ways, and perhaps conditions will get more fortuitous to that, because that certainly happened for the Italians. It just sort of, they wanted something.
But does it show that you don't necessarily have to have everything perfectly neat and everyone singing off the same hymn sheet as the Chinese? It's like you can have a horrible, bubbly mess and it all just kind of works.
Yes, exactly. That is the Italian kingdom, then republic, just kind of works. And it continued to. So the 1870s were the time, 1870s up until World War I, this was sort of the time of the time of monsters, really, in terms of European empire. The British, primarily the British, but sort of in their coattails, the French and others were taking over the entire world and doing so quite savagely. And Italy desperately wanted a seat at the table. In the run-up to World War I, they were able to take Libya, and they did actually administer Libya more or less for, I guess, 40, 50 years thereafter. That said, I mean, Italy is today.
Were they brutal to the Libyans?
Oh, I'm sure they were. I mean, they were European imperialists of the late 19th century, early 20th century. I don't know too many of the details because probably there aren't that many details. Like Libya today is famously a massive, vast territory with very few people in it, like 6 million people in this almost, a third of a continent-wide country.
Outstanding.
And how many fewer people there must have been in 1908 or 1912? I can't remember when the Italians took it. There wasn't a lot going on there. The Italians were famously sort of allotted a section of Horn of Africa coastline by the British and the French, who said, well, we don't want either one of us to have it, so let the Italians have at it. And they famously made a hash of it. In 1896, at the Battle of Adwa, the Italian military was humiliated by an Ethiopian army. And that is, in part, also because of really fortuitous geography, but that was in part why Ethiopia, alone among African countries, managed to stay independent throughout the period of European imperialism. Was because the Italians just couldn't hack it, could not actually take over this African country, which was a great humiliation that Mussolini avenged in the 1930s to the great detriment of the Ethiopians, the Italians, and the world. But I think the Battle of Adwa was sort of worth mentioning. The Italians don't win so many wars. The great counterpoint to what I've been saying there would be World War I. Where the Italians... It's interesting. So World War I is definitely part of this cavalcade of failure and destruction and poor organization on a horrific level. It's a lot harder to joke about Italian failure in World War I because we're talking about tens or hundreds of thousands of deaths. But at the same time, until the Battle of Caporetto in 1917, for at least, I can't recall if the Italians jumped in 1915 or if they were there from the beginning in 1914, but the Italians did go toe-to-toe with a military that was going toe-to-toe with Russia. They had developed to the extent that they were the military equals of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
I've heard it described as like Austria was terrible at fighting at the time, but Italy was sort of slightly as... There seemed to be a horrendous leader at Luigi something, who just seemed to be sending wave after wave of men. He was horrendously brutal, and a lot of like stereotypes we would have with like Russia in World War II, or you could say Italy was up to worse in the Alps. Like he just seemed to be send men, send prisoners, have everyone die, and then just do it again. Like it seemed to be just everything that was happening on other fronts in World War I, but just run by absolute monsters, which is, I think, saying something.
I think the classic description of the British military during World War I was it was lions led by donkeys.
Yes, the Lions Led by Donkeys is a podcast as well that do an episode on the Italian offensive. I actually went to see them. They did a show in Belfast there.
Oh, very cool.
This week. But yeah, they do one on the Italian campaign during World War I and just how brutal and horrific it was, which I think saying something.
I don't dispute any of that, but I think that does kind of serve my point. The fact that the Italian military that had lost completely to the Austrians in 1848 had failed to defeat the Austrians in 1866 as the Austrians were getting their clocks cleaned by the Prussians. This was Italy had developed to the point between 1915 and 1917 where they were capable, no matter how savage or brutal or horrible it was, they were capable of maintaining the level of total war that the other countries were maintaining. And in fact, it was when they did absolutely end up getting humiliated at the Battle of Caporetto. But I think the point is before they eventually did get humiliated, and it wasn't just the Austrian military that humiliated them. I believe it was the Germans who decided in 1917 that they were going to turn down south and help the Austrians close out this part of World War I. For 2 years before that, they were able to maintain a horrific, grueling level of exertion that showed that Italy, despite its nonstop military failure and humiliation, had become a real country with real resources and real capacities, that in the fall of 1917 got its ass kicked. The Battle of Caporetto, Germans turned south, and the Germans and the Austrians were able to inflict a absolutely brutal defeat on the Italian Republic. I think hundreds of thousands of deaths or just prisoners. They lost like 100 miles of Italian territory. They did finally, at a river, with the support of, I think, the French and British allies, did manage to stop the German Austrian onslaught. But that's sort of where the Italian front sat until the very end of the war, when the Austrian military and state was actually collapsing. And I think you can certainly, I'm certain Italian nationalists would argue that it was the victorious Battle of Vittorio Veneto that crushed the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I think it's probably more accurate to say that in the 3 weeks before the armistice, the Austrians were already collapsing and the Italians just sort of managed to take some territory as sort of a consolation prize. Regardless, despite kind of failing militarily in World War I, they were sitting at the winner's table once again and got to go to the Treaty of Versailles as got to go to Versailles to negotiate the treaty ending the war as one of the great victors of World War I. And I believe picked up a little bit more territory that helped to solidify the final version of Italy that we know today. Again, a kind of wacky story of horrific loss that leads to Italian victory.
Is there anything you could sort of recommend with this? Like, does Italy seem to have particularly good politicians, or, what is it, do you think, that they have that gives them an edge over other countries?
Does Italy have particularly good politicians? Which brings us to Mussolini.
Yes.
I think Italy has tremendous capacities, tremendous capabilities. I can't really point to an Italian politician, having read a book on Italian history, a 500-page book on Italian history from the age of Napoleon up until the modern era. I can't think of an Italian politician that I have a ton of affection for. Maybe some of those heroic prosecutors who battled against the mafia in the 1960s, 1970s, got assassinated. Those seem like some pretty amazing people. But the folks at the top of Italian politics are just sort of uniformly like, I can't say that I was like deeply impressed with any of them. And then some of them were just terrifically bad, like Benito Mussolini, which is actually where we get to directly after World War I. Adolf Hitler didn't take power in Germany until I think 1932 or 1933. There's a very quick flash in the pan that was Adolf Hitler, from 12 years from semi getting elected to power and then taking power in Germany to being dead in a bunker. Mussolini took power in the early 1920s. So this guy had a full 2 decades on top of Italy. And,
But also, wasn't he massively influential around the world?
He absolutely was.
In a way that Hitler wasn't quite, because he was there for so long. It was like, well, Mussolini's doing it and things seem to be going okay there.
Yeah, I mean, worldwide fascism was attractive. In the event, Mussolini proved to not be able to deliver many or any of the things that he was promising. Fascism is deeply rooted in violence. I don't think we don't have the time to get into what fascism is or isn't, but fascism, as instantiated by, I guess you would call Benito Mussolini, its founder, was about military strength and vigor and blood of the nation. And when the rubber hit the road in the 1930s and in the 1940s, fascist dream of Italy and Mussolini was punctured with great viciousness. But before his military impotence, frankly, was demonstrated by World War II and its sort of opening acts, yes, it was, as you say, it was tremendously internationally attractive. I think there were a lot of Latin American governments that introduced fascist elements, the Asian governments that can be seen as inspired by the fascists to some degree. And yes, Adolf Hitler himself and the Nazis did look to Benito Mussolini and what he had done the way that he had sort of trampled liberalism. And this is something that they would fascists like Mussolini and Hitler would sort of openly advocate, the way that they had really trampled democracy and sort of wimpy, whooshy liberal ideas. This was something they were proud of. And yeah, Mussolini was tremendously influential. I am not somebody who's like, well, there is, I don't think there's much of this, but it can be tempting sometimes if you contrast Mussolini to Hitler to be like, well, he wasn't as bad as Hitler. And he wasn't. I mean, he was not as monstrous as Hitler.
What an incredibly low bar.
Exactly. But he was pretty monstrous and, murder.
Oh, yeah.
I think when the fascists took power, there was a courageous. There's an Italian politician who I idolize. I was M something. I don't know I can't recall what his actual name was. But he got up after the fascists took power in the Italian parliament and made a speech calling out their corruption and the absurdity and the shame of this. And he was assassinated, 4 days later, more or less openly by fascist thugs. Mussolini was a little embarrassed by this and had to cover it up to some degree, but everybody knew what happened. It was a disgusting political system led by a disgusting man. But, he made the trains run on time, is the famous cliche that I think is probably a little overdone. But
apparently it's completely not true. He once made a train run on time that he needed to go on. But it's incredible just how people will constantly create new realities. People be like, oh, yeah, well, if you're a dictatorship, then things run properly. And you're like, no, it's just complete nonsense.
What he did was continue forceful, violent nation building in Italy from the early 1920s until the early 1940s. And it is an open and kind of dark question that I think comes to mind when we look at Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia, as I will have done recently by the time this comes out on the YouTube channel. Like, to what degree is like this level of like horrific dictatorship, violence, oppression, to what extent is this useful in nation building? Did those 20 years of fascist dictatorship help consolidate things for Italy in some ways? It absolutely ended in horrific disaster for the Italians and everybody else. But yeah, it's a really uncomfortable question, because Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia is I don't know if I'd use the term fascist, but he's certainly an authoritarian leader who is creating wars for his benefit that may be effective in sort of nation building or may not. The question of Mussolini isn't just a question for, historical antiquarians. It's also a question about things that are happening today. So it's another reason why I think more attention should be paid to these eras of history. What happened to Mussolini? Well, and this was an interesting thing I learned from this book. And this is one of the great benefits of reading a nice thick book on the history of what happened here, is that even before Mussolini's more famous failures in World War II, he was already sort of burning the seed corn and failing miserably at being this Italian exciting fascist dictator that he'd set himself up as. One of the great crimes of the 1930s, up there with Japan's serial invasions of China, was the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. This came in 1935. This is, I believe, the point at which the League of Nations, the sort of half-assed United Nations that the U.S. had never signed up to, that existed between World War I and World War II, this is sort of the point at which it lost all legitimacy. Mussolini decided to avenge the 1896 Battle of Adwa and take over Ethiopia through the use of fighter jets, poison gas, all manner of the horrific paraphernalia of modern warfare. He was, at extraordinary cost, able to conquer Ethiopia for Italy. What this book makes clear, The Force of Destiny by Christopher Duggan, highly recommended. What that book makes clear is that this was ruinously expensive for Italy. They really couldn't handle this level of effort. At this point in the 1930s, the British Empire, with all of its wealth and all the territory it controlled, couldn't really handle that level of effort for any long period of time, the effort of World War II sort of sent the British Empire further under U.S. economic tutelage. And fascist Italy, behind the facade, couldn't really handle this either. Like, the state was already, verging towards bankruptcy. This military effort crushing the Ethiopians was not something that they could really handle. So invaded in 1935, did finally manage to take over the country by 1937. This was a massive 2-year effort that was eventually successful. So yes, Ethiopia, I guess, was colonized, but it only lasted for 4 years, really.
What was the main reason? Was there anything particularly incredible there, or because it seems like it just was a money pit?
It was open territory in Africa. It was the only.
And that was it. There was no like massive gold deposits rumored or anything like that.
I'm sure Ethiopia today has a great mineral wealth, and I'm sure that there was some mineral wealth involved, but primarily it was just a prestige thing. Italy saw itself as a great power, so Italy wanted a slice of Africa. It was just as pointless as most colonization of Africa. The British had the Suez Canal in Egypt. They had a variety of gold and diamond mines in South Africa. And I don't think anybody else, including the British, the other massive territories in Africa that the British had, I don't think anybody else was making any money or had any strategic purpose to what they were doing in Africa. They just all convinced themselves.
Because I heard this is an argument that a lot of fans of Trump use, which is, they were actually helping the place because they lost money in these regions. And you're like, no, they didn't want to lose money in these regions. It wasn't an act of charity. They intended to, but they were incredibly vicious and brutal, even if they did lose money. So they were this was something like, they give it a try and found out that it was a terrible idea.
It was, I think What If Altist in particular makes that argument. This was just being nice and bringing them free trade, which is an absolute obscenity and reveals deep ignorance.
Yes, because that's what everybody really needs.
Yeah, real deep ignorance. They were just in Ethiopia to do it. The Italian government couldn't really afford it. It was no doubt heading towards massive catastrophe for the Italian state until World War II came along. And it, instead of being eventual catastrophe for the Italian state, it was more or less instant catastrophe for the Italian state. You'll note that, November 1941, that's before the United States even joined World War II. And I believe it was the British that quickly cleared Italy out of Ethiopia. So before the arsenal of democracy even joined the Allied side in World War II, the Italians had lost in Ethiopia. Italian campaigns around Libya, I think, were a dramatic failure. I'm not too clear on the details here, but my understanding is that's why the Germans had to waste all kinds of resources. Send the Desert Fox into Africa because Italy couldn't hold on to Libya, and they didn't want, the soft underbelly of Italy to be from Africa up through Italy to be used to attack Germany. And that's not the only time. I guess we should be grateful to Mussolini, actually, for losing World War II for Adolf Hitler.
Also Greece as well?
Yes. Famously, Mussolini invaded Greece, was going to take it over real easy, and got his clock cleaned by the Greeks. So the Germans had to pile in, which some argue delayed their invasion of Russia long enough to end up with Germany losing the war. So I guess we should be grateful to Mussolini for that, I suppose.
Was it also possible that Italy it didn't take to fascism quite as readily and as fully as Germany did? I've heard that's one reason why quite often they did so badly in World War II is they just didn't like Mussolini. They didn't want to fight, while Germany was completely 100% behind it.
Well, I mean, there could be something to that, but I think it's important to point out that the Italians were happy to sit under Mussolini's fascist government for 15 years before Mussolini proved himself to be a kind of worthless leader. I think certainly by the end of 1941, the morale of the Italian military was in the toilet when it was pretty clear, it had become very clear to them that they were not, in fact, this amazing fascist war machine, that they could actually see The Germans being, in fact, the Italians who had supposedly come up with this idea were a
But
bit of a
Roman
joke.
Empire, Rob. That's all you need to
Yes.
say over and over
Yes.
again.
Yes, the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire. Mussolini lost in Ethiopia, he lost in Greece, he lost in North Africa, and then much earlier than the Japanese and the Germans, he straight up lost to the Allies. I thought I put the actual date down here, but it was in 1943. At some point, Italy surrendered, essentially. So a mere sort of 2 years after the U.S. entrance in the war, Italy had surrendered. Of course, the Germans then refused to let Italy surrender, invaded Italy. So the Americans had to fight up and I think sometimes described as like the Forgotten War. American and I think British, but perhaps primarily American troops fought their way up the Italian peninsula in truly brutal fighting. I think famously destroyed Monte Cassino, which was the seat of, I think, European monasticism. The Benedictine order was started there. It was destroyed. Great losses for the Italians, for the Germans, for the Americans fighting their way up.
Well, a bit like most things in World War II, it seemed like all sorts of countries were involved. You know, lots of New Zealand Canadians, Polish, South Africans, even Brazilians. But yeah, a lot of Americans as well.
Truly horrific fight that, interestingly, much like the French allowed, or even more ridiculously than the French, allowed Italians to make a sort of claim that actually we were on the side of the good guys and the Allies the whole time, which is a bit absurd. That Italy was no longer in a world of titans like FDR's United States or the USSR. There was no question of allowing Italy to sort of sit on the Security Council or sort of sit at the winner's circle. But, you know, a great, as in France, like a great mythology of with, to be clear, like a nucleus of very real fact of the Italian partisans and the resistance to the fascists and the Germans who hung on in the north. Italy surrendered in 1943, but I think Mussolini didn't end up getting killed until 1945 because he sort of founded a new sort of fascist republic in the north.
Yes, famously upside down.
Yes, strung up by wire. So there absolutely was Italian resistance heroism in World War II, but you know, probably not as many as were fascists. Regardless, Italy was not loathed as much as, say, the Germans or the Japanese were because they were out of the war so early. And of course, the United States quickly became more concerned about fighting communism than they were about whatever the fascists were up to. Interestingly, Italy had a very powerful, I think might still, Communist Party, probably one of the more powerful in Western Europe throughout the Cold War, but also like I think much of Western Europe during the Cold War, I think was sort of dominated by sort of Christian Democrats of some sort. And, you know, we've already gone over, which is good because I don't have too much to say about the period after World War II, other than it was kind of economically miraculous, resulted in eventually Italy becoming briefly a more wealthy country than the United Kingdom. So it's just kind of an extraordinary story of almost laughable chaos that led to extraordinary success. And I think that we don't need to be as caught up in the romance of sort of, you know, national domination and victory as sort of like the standard stories of a country's success tend to be. You can, if you're consistent about what you want and you focus on nation building, your opportunities will come, no matter how bad you are at taking advantage of them. Italian history has a pretty hopeful message that I think more people should pay attention to.
Well, thank you very much for listening, and enjoy your new America.
Enjoy your new America, indeed. I hope we're all still alive.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire: What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.